1913. Dick Bird, a young energetic cameraman, arrived in Canada to take up the challenge of recording some of the life of the nation. Working for the Pathoscope Company in Toronto, Dick traveled the length and breadth of the country, recording the activities of its people. His films, and the films of his colleagues at Pathoscope, were the first attempts to record Canadians at work and at play, so that other Canadians would understand their nation better. The Provincial Ploughing Match, Brampton, Ontario, 1917. The Motion Picture Bureau of Ontario distributed this kind of film through schools, churches, and community organizations. In those days, a movie cameraman was always something of a novelty. Often Dick's camera was the first motion picture camera that people had seen.
I came out to Regina, actually, for the Pathoscope Company of Toronto for 2 years, and I made for the provincial government about 25 films of agriculture and other subjects, educational subjects and so forth.
When Dick arrived, there was still plenty of room for others. Immigrant ships were landing thousands of farmers and businessmen from Europe, eager to find happiness and a place to grow in a new land. They brought with them their language and cultural traditions. They used the agricultural methods of their forefathers to break up the rich earth and build houses in the way they had done for generations. They felt at home here because the Great Plains were so similar to the plains of the Ukraine and Eastern Europe. They knew that prosperity was attainable through hard work, and they worked hard, soon showing the fruits of their labor.
Well, then, my wife, my first wife, was afflicted with severe asthma. And I found out by bringing her out here that actually it's a dry climate and so forth, evidently had a good effect on her condition. So I decided to stay here. And I organized the Regina Films Limited with a studio in the Banner Building on 11th Avenue.
The Saskatchewan provincial government, concerned to show the public what it was doing to help the immigrants, commissioned a film that would show how settlers from Ruthenia and Galicia were integrating into provincial life. Dick made the film, directing his attention to a small Ukrainian community living near Hafford. One section of the film depicted the life of a young man from infancy through childhood to university graduation. While growing up, the boy makes contact with many aspects of Canadian culture. At graduation, he is presented as a successful Canadian, looking forward to a bright future. In those days, a cameraman had to work on his own.
When I look around me here, as we are tonight, this is so strange with me because I did all this myself. I mean, I developed the film,
wrote the script.
I made the titles, I wrote the script, I made the prints from a reduction printer that I made from a 35 millimeter projector and attached a 28 millimeter portion of the reduction printer and made my own prints.
After the death of his first wife, Dick developed new interests in cinematography.
Mr. Fred Bradshaw was the curator of the Saskatchewan Museum in Regina, and he had always been after me, why don't I make motion pictures of the wildlife of the prairies? And I wasn't very enthusiastic about it because actually I'm not or wasn't at that time, very much interested in wildlife. But I decided that I would try it. So I took my camera out to an area that is now the airport, just outside Regina. And I found after some difficulty, because I really didn't know at that time very much about the creatures that nested on our prairie. But I did find a nesting bird, a ground nesting bird with eggs. So I set up my camera at some distance away to get a long shot of the location of the nest and watch for the bird to return to the eggs, which he did. I got some pretty fair shots in the long shot. Then I moved up a little closer and made similar shots, and then moved very close and got some very good close-ups. Well, I took the film back to the studio, developed the negative, and next day I made a print, and I phoned Fred and asked him to come down and see the print. If I do say it myself, it was a very good sequence of shots. They were sharp, clear, and although I didn't know the name of the bird, Fred, of course, easily identified it. And I suppose because this seemed to be very easy. So I went back the next day to find another ground nesting bird. I spent hours waiting for this bird to return to her nest. And I think at that time, on that occasion, I began to feel that this is not as easy as I imagined it. And I think that intrigued me. And since then, of course, for over a period of years, I became hooked by the wildlife idea.
Dick had to share his new enthusiasm with others, and he relived his wildlife adventures in Camera Trails, a quarter-hour weekly radio drama. The program advertised his photographic store and sponsored a children's nature club. Dick had met Ada Bovey through his radio program. Ada was a nature enthusiast and an ideal companion for Dick, the veteran photographer. They pooled their knowledge and talents, and wildlife photography monopolized their subsequent years. They gradually learned each other's specialty and were married in 1947. Characteristically, they spent their honeymoon photographing wildlife in a Mexican jungle. Each summer, they went off to shoot wildlife footage, and in winter went on lecture tours, primarily in the United States. Their film of New Zealand, shot in 1959, took 4 months to produce and was booked in 28 cities in the United States and Canada before a foot of film was shot. On tour, Dick gave a commentary while Ada projected one of their films, Newfoundland, British Guiana, Camera Trails, or Alphabet of the Outdoors. Dick's films were always silent. He never took a tape recorder with him or tried to use sound effects, relying solely on a lively, humorous narrative to entertain his audiences. It wasn't long before the excellence of his photography came to the attention of Disney Productions and led to an offer of work. Apart from William Carrick, the Birds became Canada's only wildlife cinematographers on Disney Productions.
One of Disney's representatives had seen some of our films, our wildlife films, when we were on a lecture tour in the United States. As a matter of fact, he came all the way from California to interview me, to ask me if we would work for him, for Disney. Matter of fact, I think he said, "Where the hell have you been all these years?"
Several of the films that are still being shown on TV of material that we made in the mountains, the pica material, the mountain material that they use on TV is primarily all ours.
Eventually, the Birds and Disney parted company on a matter of principle.
I think this was what bothered us too about the Disney photographing crews, was that it got to the point where they said, well, if you can't get it in naturally, then make it happen. And this we would not do, and we refused to do. They had a compound set up there in Banff, outside of Banff, with lemmings and all kinds of different things that one of his photographers, McHugh, was that his name? Anyway, one of his photographers was working on, and they were using drugs to, Wolverine was one of the things that they were doing, and they were using drugs to make them so they could handle them and get pictures of them, and they did all kinds of things that we did not approve of, and we felt were not the way that nature should be photographed in under any circumstance. So that that was another reason that we didn't continue with we didn't want to be included in that group that were doing things like that at all.
For many years, the Birds were without equal in Canada as wildlife photographers. What kind of qualities made them a success?
Well, I think primarily you have to be devoted to wildlife. Your interest in wildlife has to be very deep. And then I think patience is another thing. And of course, skill of operating cameras, which my husband had for all the years of his experience. And as he said, he had an educated finger that knew when not to shoot. And so many people would say, oh, well, you must have an awful lot of waste film. But we decided that from our material, there was less than 10% waste because of the educated finger bit. And I think with your interest in nature, you simply must have time and patience to take the time to wait for your subjects to do the things that you want.
Waiting for eggs to hatch on a Newfoundland cliff needs a particular kind of patience. One year they huddled 2 days beside a Saskatchewan slough to photograph a horned grebe. Another time they waited through 16 days of rain beside a North Dakota lake to film the nuptial dance of the western grebe. A thunderstorm eventually washed out the nest and the birds. Waiting for a sighting gave the birds an opportunity to photograph many charming insights into their life together as naturalists and photographers. If their humor was occasionally forced, it was natural enough to reveal the warmth of their relationship and their love of the wild country that became their home for so much of their lives. Dick's time span as a professional photographer is remarkable. If in later years he turned away from the dramatic subjects common in the age of television, it is because he is essentially a gentle person, more in tune with the backwoods than the battlefront. In their own way, the birds were conservationists, a generation before conservation became a fashionable word. The uncompromising honesty in their approach to nature remains an inspiration to all wildlife photographers.
When Mr. Bird first came to Saskatchewan, most of the people here had come as pioneers of one form or another. And most of them have stayed, and we're so happy that Mr. Bird chose to make Saskatchewan his home. What he gives to the filmmakers, not only of Canada, but around the world today, is a legacy of the early times when a filmmaker did literally everything. And so on behalf of the Yorkton International Film Festival, I would like to present you with this token of our appreciation for being an outstanding filmmaker.
It's part of our life, the motion picture is. And I hate to see so much money spent on it for films that are really not entertaining, because this is an entertainment business.